The last named suspect in the Paris attacks, Hayat Boumediene, appears to have evaded capture. This morning, Turkish officials said Boumediene traveled from Paris to Istanbul before the terrorist attacks. From Istanbul, she then crossed into Syria.
10,000 troops will soon flood the streets of France in the wake of last week's terror attack. This has plenty of questions remain as to how French intelligence got so many things so wrong. And plenty of talk about how, if possible, they can infiltrate possible terrorist enclaves in their own backyard after allowing them to breed for so long. Let's welcome back to MidPoint the Director of Studies at the Institute of Democracy and Cooperation in Paris. Commentator on international affairs and conservative journalist John Laughlan joins us today. John, thank you so much for being here again.
Thank you for having me, Ed.
John, with regard to the fact that the fourth suspect escaped, there was talk that the fourth suspect might actually be in the deli at the time, might actually be in the country. And then knowing full well that French intelligence now admits that they simply didn't have enough people, couldn't keep track of the terrorists that were already there. How are the people in France and in Paris dealing with this now? The fact that their government did so badly, specifically in letting this fourth person get away, that there now has to be new fears of a continuing terror attack against them every single day.
Yeah, well, I don't think the fears come from this particular woman. She may or may not have been an accomplice in the attacks. I think fears come from the more general problem, which is one that does not concern only France, but concerns a number of countries all across Europe and no doubt elsewhere in the world as well. Namely, the problem of, obviously, radical Islam among indigenous people, among people who live here and in many cases who were born here. The challenge for the security services is in a sense massive, and it's ultimately impossible, I think, to protect people. Obviously, you would expect security services to be able to prevent people from obtaining very serious weapons, such as those that were used on Thursday. They had Kalashnikovs. But on the other hand, there have also been terrorist attacks, notably in London a year or two ago, where a soldier was stabbed to death with a kitchen knife. Now, obviously, the security services can't prevent people from buying kitchen knives. So I think the problem, in a sense, does go beyond anything that any security service can necessarily do.
Is there a feeling, though, now from the people themselves that this government and this intelligence service is inept?
That feeling, as far as I know, hasn't been expressed very greatly, but I think that it should be. And I also think that the political response to this outrage has been completely wrong. When I spoke on your show on Wednesday, on the day of the attacks, I discussed the fear I had then that political correctness would blind people to the nature of the threat and make it impossible for that threat to be countered. Well, even I could not have predicted the extent to which we have been absolutely engulfed by political correctness, particularly in the march yesterday. The march yesterday, which was attended by a very large number of people, was originally supposed to be a march of national unity. Well, in fact, the organisers started by disinviting one of the largest parties in France, the National Front, the Front National, which, having campaigned for a generation against immigration and having warned of the dangers of Islamism, is precisely the party that should have been there. No, it was excluded. Instead of national unity, what we had was international unity. All the most politically correct figures from around the world travelled to Paris to demonstrate. And as your clip with George Clooney just showed, politically correct figures across the other side of the Atlantic have joined in as well. Nobody in the march denounced Islam or Islamism. People instead demonstrated in favour of tolerance. Well, I'm afraid tolerance is not going to make this problem go away. There were so many questions left open by the marches yesterday that I'm now left deeply pessimistic about the political or indeed security capacities of the French state or of any European state to deal with them.
John, 30 seconds and then we'll take a break. Do you sense that the French government is going to get involved in these pockets of Muslimism, if you will, the communities where they are not allowed? Are they going to do anything to now start investigating what is there in their own midst?
Well, it's difficult for me to know exactly what security measures are already in place. I'm a political analyst. I'm not an expert on terrorism or counter-terrorism. I know from my own country, Britain, that for many years the British security services have, of course, penetrated into prisons, which are a big incubator for radical Islam. And I can only assume that the French authorities are trying to do the same. But I repeat, there is only a limited amount that one can do against such attacks.
All right, hold that thought. Break and we're back in what would be the worst case scenario in fighting a roving band of killers around the world. It's coming up on MidPoint. So welcome back to MidPoint. Director of Studies at the Institute of Democracy and Cooperation in Paris, John Laughlan joins us. John, the president is getting a tremendous amount of criticism here at home for not attending any of the rallies in Paris. Neither he nor John Kerry nor the vice president. Are the French as angry as the Americans seem to be?
Not as far as I know, no. I think everyone was surprised by the number of foreign leaders that turned up. The whole thing went very quickly. It wasn't intended to have, there weren't intended to be foreign leaders at all at first, but they announced their presence one by one and came very quickly. No, I don't think there's any. I haven't noticed any resentment or upset that Americans were not present. No.
Well, now we hear about a potential terrorism summit put together by the president to bring everybody together. Let's be very frank here, John. We've had a lot of years and decades now for these countries to start looking at terrorism. There's homegrown terrorism now. Law enforcement, intelligence factors have supposedly been involved in this in a long time. What's really, in your opinion, what really could happen if we get all these leaders sitting down at a table to start to discuss how to attack this form of terrorism? Because quite frankly, there are many who would see them just sitting across the table, coming up with new ideas, floating them out, walking away, having a drink at the bar and going home.
No, it's dead right. I mean, these are all substitution activities, as was, frankly, the march itself yesterday. In other words, these are displacement activities which are undertaken simply because we will not or cannot attack the real problem. It is obvious that an international summit, particularly of heads of state or heads of government, will not solve anything. Perhaps there might indeed be useful cooperation between the security services of different countries. But a political summit, no. The problem is a technical problem of counterterrorism. And unfortunately, since the events of last week, we've seen a number of other similar displacement or substitution activities. People are being told in the train to make sure that their luggage is labeled as part of a counter-terrorism operation. I mean, this is absurd. Labeling your luggage is not going to prevent terrorists. So no, unfortunately, I see such initiatives as merely an attempt to pretend to be doing something, when in fact nobody is prepared to face up to the real problem, which comes from Islam itself, not of course from all of Islam, but from a part of Islam, and of course from the fact that there are many Muslims living in Western countries, some of whom have been radicalized. That is the problem. It's very easily stated, and no doubt it's much more difficult to resolve, but you're not going to get anywhere unless you start by stating the problem clearly.
There is no doubt that the United States gets a tremendous amount of help from MI6 and from French intelligence in order to fight terrorism around the world. In your opinion, and in seeing what we have seen French intelligence do this time around, and in the massive mistakes that they made, is it just wrong? Is it just a bad idea for America or anybody else to depend on French intelligence at this point to help fight terrorism?
That's difficult to say. I'm not sure I mean, yes, I think that they clearly were obviously guilty of a failure to predict and prevent what happened last week, that by definition. Again, I think you'd have to ask a counterterrorism expert to give his professional evaluation of whether the French services have been more wanting, say, than the British or even the Americans. After all, we've all had terrorist attacks of different sizes and kinds and types. And, we are told from time to time that such attacks, other attacks have been foreseen and prevented. This claim was made last week in France by the French president. Maybe that's so. The same claim has been made in America, in Britain, and I'm sure in America. I don't think that, I'm not aware of France being in a particularly bad category in this respect. I think that instead the problem is in the nature of the beast. It's in the nature of the fact that it's very easy, if you're determined enough, to commit a terrorist attack.
About a minute left here. Are we looking at a point, and again, in your opinion, John, where we're going to have to start looking at every single person that comes through a border of a country? We're going to have to look at them, investigate them, and we're going to have to be stricter, or is that simply just going too far?
I think it might be going too far. After all, you've had those measures already in the United States. Well, I suppose there hasn't been another 9/11, you might say. I think there is something that politically can be done. I'm not talking here about the counterterrorism measures, but one of the main sources of radicalism is, of course, Libya and Syria, both countries where Western states have brought down or tried to bring down the government. The civil war was supported by the West, by America, by Britain, by France in Syria, and the result is that that country has been turned into a factory for jihad, many of whose products, having come from Europe or even from other Western countries, are now returning to their original countries, the countries of their birth, and practicing jihad there. This is really politically what politicians could do. They could cease their support for the rebellion in Syria, and they could refrain from undertaking events, operations such as the one in Libya in 2011.
And we'll make that the last word. John Laughlan, thank you so much for your time. We'll look forward to doing it again. MidPoint continues.